Hello, you're listening to the 100th episode of the Saluki Gamescast.
Thanks, Blue's Clues.
That's what I was about to say.
Thank you for the fanfare there. It's not quite the 20th Century Fox fanfare, but I suppose it'll do. This is our 100th episode spectacular, with special guest Phyllis Diller and Television's Alf. We're like pulling out all the stops for this episode. But yeah, 100 episodes. My name is Justin Young. Joining me, as always, are Alicia Utecht, Christina Ivey, and Mario Sanders. And how does it feel to be at episode 100?
It's honestly incredible. Like I was thinking about this morning actually, and thinking about how happy I am that episode 100 is Christina and Mario, who have both joined us over the course of this, and then Justin and me, who have been here from the very beginning, and like how we get to celebrate from the beginning and the people who have joined in along the way.
Yeah, because I think Mario, you've been here for about 50 episodes.
Yeah.
And then Christina, a little less than that, but probably around 30, 40.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So even though you're new to the show in to some way, you're not completely new, right?
Right.
You've been here almost half the time, 30, 40% of the time. So it's been a long journey.
Yeah.
I don't know. Any thoughts here at the beginning about being at episode 100? This mighty achievement.
I have more thoughts, but I'll save them for the end.
Yeah,
Because then I'm gonna get emotional.
Well, if we have somebody new listening or somebody who hasn't heard this in the past, I thought I would just go over real quick how the sort of genesis of this podcast. Genesis. There's a pun for video game fans.
See what you did there.
But anyways, this podcast began almost 3 years ago now.
Yeah.
And I had a double check here real quick. The first episode of this podcast was February 28th, 2022.
Oh, wow.
So just about 3 years ago at this point. And we, so I had taken it on as a project to build a podcast studio in this department. And COVID got in the way of that. And so COVID shut everything down, shut down in-person classes. A lot of equipment for this podcast studio was sitting in the spare bedroom of my house because that's where it got shipped at the time during COVID. And so it's sitting there in that bedroom. We get back and I unpack it all and set the studio up. And then a big question was, okay, well, what do we do with a podcasting studio? And I knew eventually this department would figure out ways to use this. And of course, they have with the Klein now, with Johnny's show, and lots of
And
other.
Christina's show now.
I record that at the house, actually. Yeah.
I lied. Sorry.
That's okay.
I should, though. These mics sound a lot nicer than my home mic.
But, lots of people were using it for different ways. I know T has used this to record some of his podcasts and different things. And so the idea was, okay, well, what would be a cool way to get this started? Obviously, I have a big interest in video games, and I knew OJ was the only other person in the department at the time I knew had a huge interest in video games. And so I asked him, I said, hey, would you be at all interested in this? And OJ being OJ, he was super on board
Yeah.
and excited to do that. And I said, well, okay, do you know anyone else here who would be interested? And he suggested both Alicia and Ryan. And so I reached out to both of you, and that's how you came into the podcast originally.
Yeah, and our offices were next door to each other, so we kind of knew each other, but not super well until you reached out and were like, hey, do you want to do this thing? And I was like, ramble about video games every week? Yes, please.
And, I've said this before, but that original idea of the podcast was, oh, well, maybe it'll be sort of a rotating group of hosts because I'm not sure if there will be a great deal of interest right? Like I didn't know if anybody would want to commit to doing it every single week, because for anyone listening, like it's a pretty big commitment. Like these podcasts every week are about 2 hours in length, which means we're in this room at least 2.5 hours, sometimes longer.
Sometimes longer.
I was like, sometimes 3 or 4, because we just babble before and after about life and
we
other
waste
things.
a lot of good content, like 30 minutes to an hour ahead of starting the clock.
Sometimes it's content that we do not want recorded.
Okay, fair.
Sometimes there are discussions about like university issues and that sort of thing that probably for all of our sake is not actually recorded. But sometimes personal stories that maybe people don't want recorded either. But, you know, it's a pretty big commitment. And so I wasn't sure. And then, you know, I always kind of refer to it as that line out of the film High Fidelity. I hire these guys for 2 days a week and they just start showing up every day. And that's kind of how I felt about everybody with the podcast. Like I thought, oh, well, maybe people will do this, but I don't know if they'll want to do it as a long-term commitment. And then they were super gung-ho, like all three of you, the original three, as the co-host. And then, of course, over time, the podcast sort of grew and we brought in different people as guests and everything. So, you know, we've had Jesse and, you know, Scott and other people come in and join in different episodes. You know, one of the things that I always sort of forget is how early on, like it's the 4th episode of the podcast is from the women's conference when we did that panel discussion, and that became the 4th episode. And we were, I think maybe we had already started planning that before we started recording the podcast.
I think so. I think we started planning that because I think OJ gave you my name for that. And then from there, it was like, hey, also, we're gonna be doing this podcast, and I was like, sign me up.
So we recorded that, and so it was all happening very soon at the same time, because I think we actually probably recorded that episode did that panel discussion maybe a week before it actually became an episode.
Yeah, I think that we did the first episode, and then it was the women's conference, so we recorded that.
Yeah. And
it just took a minute because that was over Zoom, and so it took a little more editing to get into podcast format.
Right, to get all that audio together. But, and, you know, that was a really cool experience as well because we were able to bring in people. And like my friend Cassandra is from the University of Iowa. Like she was able to come in and join in on that panel discussion. And, you know, I think one of the things early on in doing this podcast was, is there a lot of interest, particularly in academia? Because sometimes in academia, like I'm not trying to like put myself here, like I'm one of the founders of video games in academia, but like I remember going to conferences early on talking about video games, and it was like nobody was doing it.
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine who's in academia on Facebook make a post about you know, where are the articles on this? And then like him and I got into a conversation on that post about the fact that people don't, and by people here, I mean like academics don't realize, I think, how, I don't know, like how diverse this particular medium is and how like my friend, for example, talked about like, I learned about race and blah, 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 blah from this video game. And, and especially like a new media class that I did when I was an undergrad, the professor talked about how like if you want to see like the innovation of tech, or do you want to see what's like the you know up to date, what is the best thing, you look at the video games.
Right.
And so I think academics just sort of, it gets dismissed as like a child's medium or something that folks played with when they were younger, and there's no, for the most part, they don't see the potential, or at least I think folks are coming around to it, but it took quite a while for it to seem legitimate at all.
Well, and I'll say even like coming of age as I am, like as an academic and as a pop culture scholar, this podcast is a big part of what got my brain around on, no, we can legit like talk about video games in academia, because I had done all that work to like be able to talk about like music and TV shows and comic books and whatever, but like this podcast was a big part of what turned my brain around on like, and video games.
And we should note, like, academia has always been slow on a lot of that stuff. Comic books, right? Like, very slow in sort of embracing that.
Yeah.
But, like, I know, Mario, you've had a lot of success in finding, like, a community like that with going to the PCA conference. Is it the Southwest?
Southwest, yeah.
Yeah, and finding a community of scholars that is very into talking about that.
Yeah, and a lot of them have been going there for a while. I mean, some of them 20 or so years. I mean, even at it was, kind of unexpected. At NCA this year, I was sitting at the table for the grad program with Christina and Sandy and Dustin, and walks by one of those like established people who I think he's in an English department, but I saw him and we were able to chat and talk, and he's like, oh yeah, this is my first NCA, and kind of just moseying around, seeing what there is, and told him about it, and he came to my panel and he's like, oh yeah, absolutely, I totally would have been there. And so I think like that's one of those things in terms of seeing that sense of community as somebody who he is like an established scholar, wanting to do that. And I think I've told this story before. The first time I went to the Southwest PCA, the area chair came up to me because a big group of us walked to dinner, and he was like, just introduced himself and talked about it. And, one of the things that he had said was just like, oh yeah, we want to think of this as like a collaborative group where we are helping develop people's projects. He said, I would much rather you come with a half-baked idea that you are still figuring out, and we can use this and your panel slot really as like an opportunity to workshop it rather than you coming in with something that you already feel solid on. And so seeing those sorts of that like ethos of collaboration within that group, I think is what really drew me to like wanting to do more in that area.
For sure. It's
and
like
stay in that area.
It's one of those instances where they, especially the folks who've been doing this longer, recognize how hard it is to get any recognition or to be seen as a legitimate scholar studying these types of things. And so building that community to sort of give up-and-coming scholars the answers that they've already had to, figure out and sift through, but especially between that, like, the academic delineation between high and low culture and what deserves to be studied. And I'm like, but pop culture, video games included, is something that so many people engage with that for us not to study it would be silly. Like it doesn't make sense.
I tell this story sometimes. The first time I taught a course on video games, it was at a different university, and I sort of like, I was already teaching a course on film, so I was already teaching a lot of the like sort of pop culture type stuff for the university because it was a small private school. And I sort of pitched that class, and I was like, I don't know if they're going to buy into this or not. Luckily, they did, and it was an engineering school, so there was a lot of interest from our students. And so I taught that first semester, and one of the librarians came up to me at the end of the semester, and she said, so your students have been talking to me about your class. And I knew this woman was into sort of like geeky type stuff and everything, so video games and everything. And she said, it's very funny to have them come talk to me about it. And I said, oh, like, is it positive? She said, oh, it's positive, but they're also telling me this is the hardest class they've taken in college. And I said, these are engineering majors. They're taking like thermodynamics. How is this the hardest class that they're taking? And she said, I think they just like way underestimated what the class was. And they didn't understand it was actually going to be very from an academic standpoint.
And that's Sandy, Shelby, and Janine and I are about to edit a special edition of Feminist Pedagogy about teaching pop culture. And one of the essays that I read in order to like make the call is where the author's talking about how students often dismiss classes in which pop culture is featured because they think it's supposed to be fluff, and that there's no academic legitimacy, appeal, whatever in it. But yeah, they're often very surprised at the end.
And I think to bring this back to talking about that conference that we did for the women's conference, we did a panel discussion called She Got Game. And as part of that, one of the things that really surprised me, so like most of the people who are in attendance on something like that are going to be academics. So it's faculty from different departments, but it's also people who work over in the library or work over in admissions or something, but people with a very like strong academic background. And we did this discussion, and then at the end of it, it is all these women, mostly women in the discussion, who are talking about, I'm so excited about this game, or I'm so excited about this game. You know, like lots of discussion about Horizons at the time, like women super excited about that, right? And like that's one of the things that I think has been really kind of fun in doing this podcast is bringing in different people and getting like what is the little niche that they're particularly excited about, and particularly being able to expose that in a lot of ways. And, you know, I have my interest, and I have the things that I'm particularly interested in from an academic standpoint, just from a video game enthusiast standpoint. And part of the fun of having different hosts in here is getting to have those different perspectives, right? Like I have still not gotten around to playing Sonic Frontiers. I don't know when I will. I have never played Dead by Daylight.
I was about to say, I want to say Alicia and I have had a similar conversation, and or maybe I was having it with somebody else, and I'm like, someone was asking me about the podcast, and I was like, yeah, I'm the horror gamer on the thing. Alicia is the Sonic, Kirby, the like, I don't want to say cutesy games because I don't want to like delegitimize it, but you're the, you know, that anime uwu kind of gamer. You know what I'm saying?
Anime gamer may be better than cozy gamer.
I don't know. Justin's the one that played Gun Gal or whatever.
I say, hold up.
And I don't know.
I try to sample everything.
Well,
is that what it is?
I've noticed that, like, even,
hey, I also played Dream Daddy.
Oh my god.
Okay, Dream Daddy's amazing though.
I don't even want to know what this game is. Like, Dream Daddy. Shh. Don't.
Speaking of opening people's eyes and perspectives,
I can't believe you don't know Dream Daddy.
I don't know Dream Daddy.
Oh, you should
study queer games.
Yeah.
Well,
it's exactly what
the conversation I think
we're gonna talk about this later.
I've played Shower with Your Dad. Is that?
No, but that's also a good game.
I'm gonna fill you in on Dream Daddy later.
And Genital Jousting. That's the kind of queer games that I'm playing.
That is also a good game, but one that we do not play at Playing for Pets. For
I can't imagine why.
Exactly.
I can't imagine
the same
why.
reason that we play Mount Your Friends with the clothes on.
Yes. The first year we were doing Playing for Pets, and I had that game before we actually did the event. I booted it up just to make sure it was working and everything, and it popped up on screen. I was like, "Oh no!" I've got the clothes aren't really the issue. It is what is dangling that is the issue.
Oh jeez.
And I keep forgetting. I want to download that game just to not. This is gonna sound, just to see, cause like the physics. I know how I had to manipulate my character to get to the top, and so it just
Okay.
Right? Can we move on? Can we?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just gonna let her keep digging her hole.
I would normally, but we are on a timer today.
I would like to point out the grin that's on Mario's face. I think I roast him enough where this is karma.
I mean, he is going to be able to roast you off of this for months, if not years, to come. So, but yeah, and so just the fact that people have stuck with this, right? And obviously, people have moved on. So,
Ryan, OJ, we love you.
Ryan and OJ got jobs that took them away, and people like
both of those are also my advisees,
which makes sense.
Yeah.
But even people like Carly, right, who had
Carly
been a regular contributor.
And
It's that's been a really cool experience over time, and one of the things that I make a point of quite often when talking about this podcast is I don't think most people appreciate how difficult it is to get to 100 episodes of a podcast.
Yeah.
It's very, very, very few podcasts get to 100 episodes. And, that's really a commitment of all the people involved with it. So if we're taking some time here to toot our own horn and to celebrate, it's because it is a worthwhile celebration. And we're very excited about it, and I think very proud of it, and rightfully so. But we do have some kind of fun content planned for today for the episode. So we decided what to do with a 100th episode. We thought we would each pick 5 games that are personal favorites or in some way important to us. And we would just talk about those. We would share those. So this isn't necessarily a top 5 games of all time list or anything of that nature, but these are just 5 games that have had an impact on us or have been important in our life at some point, and we feel like it's worthwhile showcasing and talking about those. So that's what we're going to do this episode. We're going to kind of go around and give each person a chance to introduce and talk about their game, and then anybody who wants to jump in and maybe talk about it as well, their own experiences. But for a podcast all about video games, we view this episode as a celebration of video games. So with that introduction out of the way, let's start talking about those. And Alicia, you are setting, for those who don't know, Alicia sits across from me every episode, so we go sort of counterclockwise when we go in our order. So, Alicia, why don't you start with one of your 5 favorites?
So I'm going to start with one that I talk about occasionally, but I don't talk about a ton, and that is Kingdom Hearts, particularly Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, those first 2 games. These were big games for when my sister and I were growing up. We would take 30-minute turns on the computer or on the PlayStation or whatever. And so in order to get the most out of our time, we would do where she would play one game and I would play the other. We did this with Final Fantasy 7 and 8. We did this with all kinds of stuff. And so with Kingdom Hearts, she played Kingdom Hearts 1, I played Kingdom Hearts 2. No, the story of 2 made no sense even when things were fairly linear and they were the only games because I was playing it right while she was working her way through 1. So we didn't really know what was happening, but it didn't matter. But just these games were and are still so special to me for all of those memories and those connections that the whole reason we got into them was because she had become friends with people. She was in middle school at the time, and she had become friends with people where all of them had assigned themselves Organization 13 members. And so then they assigned her a character. They assigned her Tifa Lockhart because they couldn't think of anyone else, which I don't know how they didn't go for Kyrie with her, but whatever. But so
those Philistines.
Yeah. But so that was what got us into it, and it became such a core part of my life growing up. So many memories of, like I said, sitting in the basement, taking our 30-minute turns, going back and forth, and then from there also diverging out into Final Fantasy and playing all of the insane spin-off. I can't tell you the whole lore of Kingdom Hearts anymore, but I could at one time.
I'm not sure anyone can.
I was going to say, that's impressive if you could, because I know they have YouTube videos that are 3 hours long dedicated to the lore.
Yeah, I could have at one time. I can no longer. But Kingdom Hearts, I think I've said this before. We had a big question one time that was if you would get a video game tattoo, what would it be? And it would be the original Keyblade for me because it's all of those memories with my sister. So that's my first answer is Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah, I remember how just sort of mind-blowing at the time when they announced that game. Hey, we're going to make a game that's a mashup of Final Fantasy and Disney. And it seemed like it seemed like one of those things like, is this April 1st? Is this a practical joke? Because you could actually make a lot more sense of, we're going to take the Mario characters or the Nintendo characters in general, who already feel like sort of Disney characters, right? Like Kirby feels like a Disney character. He should go hang out with Stitch. They both like eating stuff. So like that made a whole lot of sense. But like to take Final Fantasy, which is, you know, sometimes goofy, but also very dramatic, and then take Mario and Goofy and stick them in there, it felt like this bizarre mashup that absolutely should not work. And then the fact that those games are so beloved was just really cool, like that they managed to pull it off. Like I think they've sort of diluted it with all the spinoffs and everything and made it confusing. But I think you're very right. Those first two games really nailed it, and there's a reason that they're so beloved by so many people.
I love that game. I wonder if that's another one of those games. Like you mentioned Horizon as being a game that a lot of women or femme players like identify with. I wonder if Kingdom Hearts would also be one of those.
Oh, I think absolutely.
Because I don't know what it is about it. If it's the way it tells its story, it's like a very sweet story. I don't know why, but it's one of those games.
Yeah.
I think Disney is sort of a way into it, right? Like it's got the Disney characters, and then Final Fantasy is nothing but like high drama, and so I get the appeal there, right? Cool game. All right, Christina.
Yeah.
Give one of yours.
So I'm sure most people expect me to talk about Dead by Daylight, but I feel like I talk about Dead by Daylight every week. And so while that is definitely in the top...
So I'm going to talk about it some more.
No, but I actually have that, because I have a list of 6 here. I bracketed that and put every week next to it. So it's like, let me talk about these other 5 since I talk about Dead by Daylight on the podcast a lot.
She just spent 2 minutes talking about
it. Listen, so it's there. The first one I want to talk about actually is what kind of got me. I also love horror, but I also really love interactive action adventure games that feel like a movie that I occasionally like. You're participating in the movie basically, and my favorite of those is probably the first one that I watched, and that's Heavy Rain. Heavy Rain came out in 2010, I want to say in the PS3, and then got ported over to the PS4. And essentially you play as, at least initially, as Ethan Mars. Ethan is someone who, it opens up on his son Jason's birthday, and while they're out shopping, Jason gets kidnapped and becomes a victim of the Origami Killer, who is a serial killer that takes young boys, drowns them during the rainy season, and then leaves them somewhere with an orchid on their chest.
And can I just jump in here real quick and point out that the scene where he gets abducted, you're like in a mall.
Yes.
And you have a button
to say Jason
that just says Jason. And so you're wandering around this crowded mall and just hitting this button going, Jason.
Yeah.
And
it's a meme.
It's been memed to death, but it's also like, it also like is very effective at making you feel helpless.
Yes, absolutely. Like there are so many points, so you play as different characters. You play as Ethan. You play as Scott Shelby, who is a private investigator who's investigating the Origami Killer. You play as Madison Page, who is a journalist picking up on the thing that ends up becoming, well, I guess it depends on what choices you make, can become a love interest for Ethan. And then Norman Jayden, who is like an FBI investigator. And there are several moments throughout where Ethan has to go through all of these different things in order to get clues about where his son is. And there's one in particular, like, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details, but where you end up driving like backwards on an interstate. And it was so intense. I like crashed immediately and then had to put the controller down and just be like, like that one was intense. The one right before then, where if you haven't played it by now, you should play it. But like he has to choose which finger to cut off. Like, and the act of doing that, even though it wasn't painful for me, it was painful for me of trying to do it. And with that being my first experience with those types of games, it's something that really stuck with me and then got me to watch more. So from there, watching the Walking Dead games from Telltale, then that leading me to the Wolf Among Us, which I really love. And of course, games like even with the horror sense with like Until Dawn, Detroit Become Human, which was absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah.
So, but I feel like Heavy Rain, at least for me, is kind of where it all began. And honestly, the story of it, it would be difficult because, again, it's one of those that you can have multiple endings depending on what you do throughout the game, what choices you make. But I really wish they would make it into like an actual movie because I feel like its story is very, it's really captivating. And I think a lot of folks would identify with it, but kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of people don't interact with it because it's a video game. But it's a really heavy story and a really good one, I think.
I may have told this before on this podcast. I know I tell it when I teach the video game class because I use this as Heavy Rain as an example. There's a nighttime invasion scene where you're playing a female character in her apartment and people break into the apartment.
Yep.
And I was playing that while a female friend was watching me play it. And she wasn't really paying a whole lot of attention, but kind of half watching, half doing something else at the same time. And that scene, by the end of it, she said, "Look at my arm."
Yep.
And she said her hair was standing straight up. She had like goosebumps on her arm and everything. She said that just bothered me so much watching it. And I said, so one of the things I talk about with it is, right, like as a man, it's really difficult to understand the vulnerability women often feel alone, right? So like, the easy example is walking alone at night.
Yep.
Like I am very rarely scared walking across campus at night. But like I talk to lots of women who are like, yeah, I feel real nervous
It's
or
terrifying,
uncomfortable. And that's still somewhat difficult for me to understand, even though I'm trying to be very empathetic and understanding. Like it's because I just don't have that same reaction. And so one of the things I talk about is I feel helpless in that scene when I play it. And if video games can do anything, they're doing the same thing that great literature and great films have done, which is put us into the shoes of somebody else and make us feel empathy.
Yeah.
And I think in that situation, right, like that's the closest I've felt to that just sort of panic and terror and helplessness that and I don't want to say all women, but that I know some women feel like at night and feel like they might become a victim. And in that scene, I think it does it better than any game I've ever played.
And as a matter of fact, like I had forgotten about that scene until you mentioned it. I think my memory had repressed that one a little bit because that was another intense one. There were so many of those. It was almost like, there are certain movies I won't watch again. Like I won't watch Requiem for a Dream again. I'm glad I watched it, but dear Lord, I'm not going to watch it again. So, it's one of those games. And if you've never played it, I highly recommend it or watch it, honestly, because it may be too intense to play, but definitely watch it because it's so good.
All right. Mario.
Yeah, so the first game that I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if these are necessarily all favorites, but all hold some sort of meaning, is God of War, particularly the 2018, what you call it, reboot. Sure.
Yeah. Whatever the re-term is correct for that.
So I wrote my master's thesis on that game, and that was not the plan going into my master's program. I remember it was my second semester. I was in the methods class we had to take, and it was spring break, and the professor wanted us to, like, by the time you come back, you need to have like a solid idea of what you're doing this thing on. Actually, it wasn't spring break yet, but it was like right before spring break, we needed to come up with an idea. And I remember just sitting in my apartment on my bed, just like, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I don't know why that sort of popped out to me, but I thought, oh, maybe I could do something with that. Most of my research was in like masculinities, and with that reboot, they were, trying to address some of those, toxic aspects of Kratos in the first 3 games, or, the first 5 games, including the spinoffs. And so I thought, oh, maybe I could do something with that. And so I, that's what I did. And over the spring break, I played it and just realized that, oh, wow, there's like a lot more to dig into here. And so changed my my thesis at that point to writing about that. And so I think like if that were just it, like that would hold enough weight for me, like personally. And so the topic of the thesis was around, a lot of it was like father and son relationships was a big part of the ways that masculinity got talked about. And I think last year when my dad died, I did a lot of revisiting it because the week before he had died, I had submitted to a conference to talk about my thesis and ended up kind of revisiting, for lack of a better term, the whole thing, just because there was so much new perspective. And, I talk about how there's one scene in that game that was like, I felt so deeply paralleled one of the last conversations that I had with him. And so that game just holds this renewed weight. I have still not played Ragnarok for really that reason, just because I knew it was going to be a lot. It's one that I want to, and I've been thinking it's getting to be that point where I want to get into it. And so I'm thinking maybe over the summer, that'll be a game that I play, or maybe just next semester, only taking one class, I'll have some more time. But yeah, that's a game that holds a lot of weight for a lot of different reasons now. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I know you've talked about that game before, and I think that's a really interesting like perspective, because like going back and like that retroactively, that game holds different meaning, right? And that is such a weird swerve for that franchise too, right? Like if you told me when God of War 2 was out, like someday this will be the most important game about my relationship with my father, I would be like, what? Like God of War? That's weird, Mario. I don't know what kind of relationship you had. But like for that franchise to sort of be reinvented, right?
It humanized Kratos in a way that, like, I despised Kratos from the original games. I'm just like, yeah, okay, you're a Greek god, like, but that the relationship between him and his son in that reboot was really lovely.
And it's one that in the thesis I'm pretty critical of.
Yeah.
That I'm like, I can see what they're doing, but I don't think this is quite as transformative as people have made it out to be. And to some extent, I still believe that. But like I said, new life experiences, providing new perspectives, it felt important to me to acknowledge and talk about that at a conference, which I've actually done multiple times. So,
yeah. And I think that's interesting, right? Because there are books I have reread at different points in my life, and those books have had different meaning at different points in my life. Like I think to put that onto a video game, right, says a lot about video games working more as an art form. That a video game can carry different meaning depending on what life stage we personally are in. And, I don't think anybody would say that about Pong. So I think it says a lot about how much video games have changed and matured.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, my first game on my list is Worms Armageddon. So I've talked about this, I think, at least briefly before here on the podcast. So first off, it's just a fantastic game. Like, this is when the Worms franchise sort of peaked gameplay-wise. And if you've never played one of the Worms games, I feel like it's a lesser-known franchise now. You basically have a huge game world, 2D, in which you have little worms, and you have a vast assortment of different weapons that the worms can use, like grenades, holy hand grenades. You can call in like carpet bombing from planes overhead. You have a pistol, you have a samurai sword, you have all these different things. Most of those weapons you can only use like once or twice. And you are usually playing with other players, so it's a multiplayer game. And Worms Armageddon we had on the Dreamcast in college. And it became that game that we would break out and play in one of our dorm rooms, setting around, and like you would order pizza and play this game. And there were several games kind of this era. There were some of the N64 wrestling games, like the WCW versus NWO, those sorts of games. But there was something particularly about Worms where like a gameplay session of it could last for hours in order to complete a game. And you have a group of people sitting around, and it's competitive, but like it's so physics-based and kind of out of your hands sometimes. Like you throw a grenade and it explodes, but that causes something to fall and land on you and ends up killing you instead of the person you're trying to kill, or the grenade ricochets around and falls onto somebody that you're not intending. That it just became this hours-long session with a group of friends, and I feel like some of the best bonding moments we had in college were not sitting around a TV playing video games, but when we were, like, this is the game that I felt like I bonded with a lot of friends over. And so there's something every time I see this game, I'm reminded of those memories of that specific time with those specific people. And I still think it's like one of the best party games ever made. It's a little complicated. I feel like, it's not as simple as like Smash Brothers pick up and play. But it holds very strong memories to this day. And so there's part of me that every once in a while goes, man, I just really want to play Worms Armageddon. Like, can I find people to play that game? So that's it for my first one. So, Alicia, we're back to you. Do you have a second game?
Well, funnily enough, my second game is Super Smash Brothers.
I almost put that, not gonna lie.
I think in particular, I have a lot of really fond memories of Super Smash Brothers Brawl. I
will say the original we played also a lot in college.
Yeah.
64, yeah.
I mean, I've played every one a lot, but I can't remember if I've talked before on the podcast about my dad's group of friends is the group, and then the kids are Generation 2, and the kids' kids are Generation 3. And so, like, these are my non-blood family. As my dad says, blood may be thicker than water, but water gets pretty thick when you live in it for 40 years. So
gross.
I was saying the same thing, but yeah.
But so every year in March we do a group trip to Wisconsin. One of the guys, his sister owns a couple of motel-y type things, but one of them is Edelweiss and one of them is Blarney Castle. And so we always go for Castle Weekend in March. And every year we bring the video games, and Generation 2, the staples for my entire, elementary, middle school, high school were Nerf Gun Wars and Super Smash Bros. Brawl tournaments. And, we would do the thing of like, we're going to do tournaments of, 72 people or whatever, and of course have a billion computer player fights. But it just has, it's so many core memories for me of sitting and playing that game again with the group. You know, again, these are basically my cousins. So particularly growing up, my blood-related cousins are all older than me on both sides. Like, I'm closer in age to my cousins' kids than my cousins for a lot of them. So being able to have this and have it be one of those things that we could look forward to every single year and know that we were going to get to play at least 7 Brawl tournaments. And it was always going to come down to either Brady and John or Brady and Chris. But darn if we weren't going to have fun getting there. So yeah, Super Smash Bros. As a whole, but in particular, Brawl has a lot of really special memories for me.
Yeah, and like I said, the N64 one we played a ton of in college. Same group of people and everything, and those are just such good games, accessible games. Everybody understands what's going on pretty quickly and easily.
It's easy to pick up and button mash, and honestly, it was my introduction to a lot of other games too, like Metal Gear, and that's what started my affection for Kirby, because I've from the beginning mained Snowball Kirby.
I was gonna say you were one of those.
Yep.
Well, I mean, it's the creator of Kirby makes Super Smash Brothers, so his master plan has worked.
Yep.
I believe there are subliminal messages in that game.
I don't think Ultimate is too subliminal about it. But and that was like how my sister and I got into Star Fox, and so like all kinds of things. Super Smash Bros. Is in and of itself a celebration of video games, I think, and so and also having it be a celebration of my non-blood family gives it a lot of really special memories.
Cool. Christina.
Yeah. So number 2 on my list was my introduction to horror gaming. There was this. My dad thought that we needed a regular Nintendo when I was all of 2 years old, and he liked to play the Friday the 13th game, and Freddy scared the poop out of me. But my real introduction to horror gaming was my uncle, who's only about 11 years older than me, brought over his PS1 one Christmas, and he booted it up and put in Resident Evil. And I didn't know what this was. And, it's like the really awful graphics, which at the time I was just like, oh my God. But he goes into that first room where the zombie's eating, and, the zombie looks up slowly, and it does the close-up of the zombie's face. I about peed myself. But yeah, that was a really formative moment of, I don't know. My mom was the type of person that was reading Stephen King while pregnant with me, so I think it just kind of I don't know, ran over into me. And then
that sounds like a Stephen King novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, while she was pregnant with me, she started losing her teeth while she was reading Tommyknockers. So there's more to that story. But so anyway,
I'm not sure we want to pursue.
It's I mean, it'll happen in the performance that I do next year. But then when we got a little older, we got a PS2 for Christmas, and and with a bunch of PS1 games, because my parents spent all of the money on the PS2 itself.
Yeah.
And one of the games we got was Resident Evil, and Brittany and I, very much like your story, we would take turns, and I was really good at figuring out the puzzles, but it was really hard for me to deal with the creepy stuff. And so Brittany was like, move over. And she would grab the controller and she'd, go through the zombies, and she punched the sharks in the face and, all of this stuff. And I would help by figuring out the puzzles. And so, very similarly, it has a lot of good memories, not only as my foundation for horror gaming, but also because Brittany and I played it a lot. And so, yeah, it's one of those. And I love all the different iterations of it. It actually has a couple of chapters in Dead by Daylight. But really that original game is, just ingrained in my memory.
Yeah, I don't think any of maybe part 4, but like I don't know that any of the other ones have had quite the impact on me as that original one did.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a magazine review of that game. It was probably a diehard game fan. And I knew nothing about this game. And they were like showing screenshots and like, you're like living in a zombie movie. And I was like, man, that sounds amazing. And like, look at this. And then getting that game, playing it. So yes, the zombie scene, right? Like I'd never seen anything quite like that in a game before. But even more so, and again, spoiler for a 30-year-old game at this point, but, you know, when you start walking down the hall
and those dogs,
the dog jumping out.
Yep. I knew even before you said it. Yep.
And like, you had
I've
just
never even played the games and I know the dogs.
Yeah, and like, you had never experienced anything like that in a game before.
That jump scare.
Yeah. And like, you know, we often talk about like it's really hard for games to be funny. I also think it's really hard often for games to be genuinely scary.
Yes, agreed.
And, you know, I think probably it's hard to go back to that game and have the same impact today.
For sure.
But at the time, that game was genuinely scary. And it was just, and it's also incredibly cinematic.
Yes.
Like, it changed the way I think a lot of games look. I don't think it gets enough credit for that, in that so many games now are chasing that, like, sort of cinematic presentation.
And it does definitely now become a meme. Like, where have you seen the one where it's like POV, like Resident Evil, and it's like, it's just this guy running, and then all of a sudden it's the camera's in a different place and he runs by it and then the camera moves again. Like,
right, yeah.
So they definitely built upon it. But yeah, that dog scene, the scene with the giant snake that you do, the scene on the rooftop with the crows, like, and you see that guy's body that's been like pecked to death. Like, those things, I'm just like, whew, it's intense.
Yeah. It's an amazing game. I think it still holds up, but like for its time, especially, it's like one of those games that's hard if you weren't there at the time to understand the like impact it had.
Yeah. And now it's really good for a laugh, especially the first 2 minutes, doing the movie part of it.
Right.
I sometimes occasionally watch just when I need a good chuckle. So.
Or, you know, here, take this, Jill.
Yeah.
The master of unlocking.
Yeah. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it captures that B-movie vibe, like maybe even better than it intended.
For sure.
All right, Mario.
So the second game is, I guess, sort of a combo, but more so NFL Street 2. The other one would be NFL Street 1. I've talked about these games a lot. And there's something about those arcadey, silly, you know, what feel like pickup, you know, football games that I have memories of, you know, after whatever it was, 7th grade, 8th grade, we'd get out of school and just walk down to the park and play football with friends. Like, that's what those games felt like. I feel like they captured that in a really great way. And they had these, for the second one at least, these like mini games that you could do as well. So they had like what was essentially a 3 flies up mode. And I remember you could like set your own rules. So you could set it to be like you had to catch, it was the first to catch 100 or the first to catch, or whoever caught the most in 5 minutes or something like that. And I remember, you know, when you're a kid and you just have infinite time, you know, I never made it all the way through, but like, I'm going to go through and win this with all of the receivers that are in the game. Like I said, definitely did not do that, but
but you had the goal.
But you know, it was one of those things that it was, you know, that's
tried.
definitely a memory of, and some of those were very hard.
It's amazing, like when you're a kid and you have infinite amount of time, the like crazy things you'll do in a game that like now you go, no, I don't even have time to look at that.
Yeah.
And so that's a game that means a lot. And I think same thing, you know, when I was a kid, I for mostly played games at my dad's apartment, and that's one I think because that game would have such like crazy moments in it as this arcade football. Those are the games where it's like, you gotta come watch this play. He did not care about video games at all, but it's gonna take a minute. You just gotta watch it. Trying to convince him, and he would most of the time. But like I said, just a lot of those memories. That's a game that growing up, those and the Maddens to an extent as well, just so much time was put into them. And so, yeah.
That's funny. I have similar memories like with my dad because like I couldn't show him Final Fantasy. He was going to go, "What is this? Why is that man dressed like a woman? Like why is his hair?"
That's not the point.
And so like football games were something I could show him, and like he would play occasionally, like, you know, standard football games. Madden, he would sit down, like especially like 8 and 16-bit. He could sit down and play a little with me. But I remember getting NFL 2K5.
Yeah.
And calling my dad in and go, "Look at this. It has like the ESPN like cutaways and everything, and then like look, there's like first person quarterback."
Chris Berman does like the halftime show.
And they're like showing actual highlights from the game that you're playing. Like they record that and store it and play it back. And I remember calling him in there, and I was like so excited to show it because I just wanted to show somebody, right? And like I knew he would understand that, where like a lot of video games, I guess he understood, he just didn't care. But like I knew like at least with a football game. And so it's kind of funny because I have that same memory of it as sort of like this almost bonding experience.
Well, I think like you said earlier about like Disney being an entry point, like football is an entry point. Where it's like, this is something that like somebody who knows nothing about video games still, they understand football and they appreciate football, so they can like come in and have a conversation about it or appreciate you know, in my sense, the silliness of it, or, you know, with ESPN, like, wow, this looks incredible for, you know, what it is and, you know, what it's doing. And so, yeah, absolutely.
And those street games, I think, are like, I feel like vastly underrated now, sort of like historically. Like, it's weird that we don't have, I mean, I understand the licensing issues, but like, why do we not have a modern update to NBA Street and NFL Street? Because those are fantastic games.
Yeah, I know they put out a third one, and there was like there was another one that wasn't NFL Street, but it was very Street-esque. I don't know. Yeah, that's a game. I've said it before though. If they came out with a new one, I would buy it pretty fast. I almost wonder if with the success of the college football game, they would consider approaching something like that. Of like, what are some of these other franchises that we have not played around with in a while? And so keep your fingers crossed.
All right. So my next game, since I mentioned Final Fantasy, my next game is Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy III. Whichever. It was Final Fantasy III the first time I played it, but now it's Final Fantasy VI. So I had played the original Final Fantasy on NES. I'd played Final Fantasy II on Super Nintendo, and I remember I took my birthday money and went and bought this game like the day, like almost the day it released, very close to its release and everything. And I remember it was at Walmart. I remember like going over to the electronics section and like so proud because it was like one of the first times like I'd saved up my money. I was going to buy this game entirely myself. Nobody was helping me or giving me any money for it. And that game was $70 at launch. Like, it's one of those things people like go, "Oh, games are so expensive now." And I'm like, let me tell you, I was paying $70 for Final Fantasy III when it came out. And like, I knew nothing about it. I hadn't played it. So it was like this big gamble at that time, right? Like $70 was a lot of money.
Shoot, that is a lot of money.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it is. It is now, but now I actually make money. It's still depressing when I blow 70 on something that's not good, but I just had so much like sort of faith in them, having played those other games. And I remember I took it home and just being entirely engrossed into that world. And it was one of the first video games I remember where the story of it all just completely engrossed me. Like these characters, this world, how this world operates, how these characters, they're like sort of interpersonal connections with one another and interactions with one another. It felt like I was not even like watching a movie. It felt like I was reading an epic novel, which I guess it is. It's like playing very much off of fantasy fiction. And it just became like to this day, like it's one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had in my life. And I remember I wrote something a few years later. I was on like the student newspaper in high school, and I wrote something about video games as art. And this was one of the games I talked about in that. And of course, at that time, it's like, this is very nerdy to be writing for your school newspaper about Final Fantasy III and like how it's art. But, you know, I look back at that now and I go, well, look where I am. Like, look what I do. Like, you know, this semester I'm teaching the video game class and everything. So, you know, that experience of going through that and playing that game, I'm not going to say it solely is responsible for my career and where I ended up and everything.
But it's part of your origin story.
Yeah, I think it really opened my eyes to what video games could be. And I think there are those games every once in a while where you're like, oh, video games can actually be something more than I ever understood them to be. And that was a game that did that. And I still think it's a game, you know, I would still recommend it to people. Like if it's a game you've never played, you should go play Final Fantasy 3/6 at some point. That's not its actual name. It's not a Kingdom Hearts game. It doesn't have math in the title. But it's still a fantastic game. Those remakes, pixel remasters, I was trying to think what they called them. The pixel remasters of it is fantastic. I guess that's the way to play it today if you're going to pick it up. But completely worth your time. And for me personally, still the best Final Fantasy they've ever made. Also, this is a little shout out to OJ because I know they agree on this one. Alicia, how about you? Your third pick.
So for number 3, I'm gonna go with Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Yeah. So this game is really special to me for a lot of reasons. When it first came out, I was dating my ex at the time, and Justin, this was when we were doing the podcast early days, so like you know this whole story, but my ex, when we were dating, you know, some couples keep like a drawer of your stuff at your significant other's place. He left his Switch at my place, so you know that was our relationship. But this, you know, when this game was coming out, I was like, I'm going to Walmart that day. I'm buying it. We're playing it. And so we played it together, and we were probably on like World 2 or 3. I don't remember exactly when we broke up. And, you know, this was one of the things that I was like, you know, I'll give you back your Switch. I'm keeping the controller that I bought. I'm keeping the games that I bought. I impulse bought myself a Switch because I was sad. But I couldn't go back to this game because it just made me cry because it made me miss him. And so then fast forward to, well, we broke up in like June or something like that. Fast forward to that next January, I was taking a posthumanism and performance class with Craig GP, and I was like, I think it's time to pick it up again. And so picking it back up at that point and playing through all of it, and then like I ended up doing in that class, I did all of my performances were performing with the game as a co-performer.
Oh, that's cool.
And then like I presented that at NCA, and it's something that I want to develop.
Cyborgy, post-human. I like that.
Yeah, and like it's something I want to develop into a full show with students and like see what games they would want to co-perform with. So, you know, spoilers for my future career aspirations. But you know, that was because the two games that we had played together were Kirby and the Forgotten Land and Pokemon Legends Arceus, and I still haven't gone back to Legends Arceus as much, just because for as interesting as it is, it hasn't like gotten me obsessed with it in the same way but Kirby and the Forgotten Land really feels to me like such a thing of like, I can look back and recognize the good things from our relationship, and getting to reclaim that game and reclaim that joy that comes with it for me was honestly a big step in my healing and a big step of me moving forward from that relationship. So, and you know, again, like I've always loved Kirby. I've always mained Kirby in Super Smash Bros., but this was the first Kirby game that I actually bought and played. So there's all kinds of, and I remember just the sheer wonder of sitting there and all of a sudden when the voice acting kicks in for the lab and just being like, what? There's voice acting in a Kirby game right now, and just everything about it is really special to me. Like I've, you know, obviously I've played and beaten other Kirby games since then, but Forgotten Land is incredibly special.
Yeah, this I guess a trend we're seeing, right? Like video games as therapy, therapeutic at least, right?
That's my next one.
But like, I think one of the things that's really interesting, you sharing that, Alicia, is like video games as like a watermark, right? Like sort of like you think of a high watermark, like this is where it flooded. And this is where the waters reached. Like if you go like downtown Paducah, they have that from like the Great Flood that hit downtown Paducah in the 30s. And I think about like you talking about like, well, when you said we were World 2 or 3, I forget exactly where, but like, you know, I stepped away from the game and everything, and a game itself, like the experience of it becoming this marker in life is really fascinating to like think about, you know, because I think music is the one that we always talk about, right? Like you hear a song and you remember exactly where you were. You remember that song that was playing during your first kiss, or the song that, you know, when you like broke up with somebody that was playing at the dance. And is thinking of media and video games in that fashion serving in that similar purpose, which I think is interesting, and it's beautiful in a way. Christina, you have your next.
So I mentioned it's therapy. When I say the name of it, you're gonna laugh at me. So I'm gonna set it up first.
My therapy game is Kirby.
Yeah, but it's cute. just hang on.
This is going to be a horror game, isn't
no.
it?
Surprisingly, no. None of the other ones are horror games, so I was trying to be really good. Okay. Anyway, so when I left to go to my undergrad in West Texas, it was really hard for me to leave, like because of things going on at home and stuff like that. I didn't have a lot of money. I was lucky enough that some people who had been there and was graduating just kind of gave me their furniture. I found like a really cheap TV. I couldn't afford internet. I couldn't afford cable. So I had a really cheap like DVD player. I watched Glee because I had bought season 1 as a Christmas gift for somebody else, and then I opened it and just watched it. And then somebody had let me borrow the first 3 seasons of The Office, and so I watched those over the weekend. And then
can I just add that that's a very Glee like plot line?
Yeah.
Yep. And then I had an old Wii. And I didn't have many games, and they were really, Wii was that one that like had the awful games that like indie people were just like churning out games, and I would buy them because they were cheap and then they would be awful. So the one thing I kept coming back to was Wii bowling.
Yeah.
And I I didn't do very well mentally in this place. It was the first place I'd ever lived where it was snowing. So my seasonal depression was like, oh, hey, hi, I've been dormant all your life. Guess what? I'm back. And
Very inside out of you.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so I would call my friend Dino. I'd be like, hey, Dino, I'm real sad. And he'd be like, girl, I'm coming over. And he would bring over this place called Chop Chop. I would order a Jackie Chan. And so he would bring me a Jackie Chan and we would play Wii Bowling. And honestly, that saved me from many nights of just like couch rot, of just like sitting there and doing nothing. As he would come over, he would usually like help me sit at my kitchen table while I did my dishes, because it was one of those like parallel things. And he's like, girl, you need to take a shower. And so I would go take a shower, and then I would come out and we would play Wii Bowling. So it was it helped me. I don't know. It was just the thing that we did. There was like once a week where we would do that, and it was really special. I got really, really good at Wii Bowling. And the first time one of us did a turkey, the other one also did. And so then it was, well, how many times can we do this? And so that was a really late night. But yeah, the gaming is therapy thing. I understand that at a very deep level, and this is just one of my games.
Well, no, it's funny you bring up Wii Sports and particularly bowling, because that was one of the we were talking earlier before the podcast about how all of us had to like cut our list down to 5.
Yeah.
And Wii Sports was one of the ones that I had to cut, because I was like, this was so many core memories with my family of like, all of us were good at Wii Bowling. My sister was the only one who was good at Wii Golf. Like, we all sucked at Wii Baseball. Like,
well, that's the one that I traded DBD for. So I'm glad I got to mention it. So you got to talk about it too. Yay.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about, games that we played collectively with people, like sort of party type games, even sometimes games that you don't necessarily think as a party game, but like certainly Wii Sports. Yep. Like I feel like when that game came out, that was the game that you could play with everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like at Christmas or Thanksgiving or anytime you were together with people.
Yeah. It was like that and Guitar Hero were the two that.
I almost put Rock Band on my list. Yeah.
But like even grandma, right? Like who doesn't play any games, like you can hand her the controller and she understands the motion
Grandma, just flick. Yeah. And you're going to shoot the ball down.
of tennis or bowling or whatever. And that game is vastly underrated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like people often dismiss it, but like it's actually like this miracle of design.
Yeah.
Because it is like you hand somebody a Wii remote and tell them to play Wii tennis. Everyone understands it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like, and that's pretty amazing. And it leads to situations like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, really cool story. All right, Mario, your third.
My third game is 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. If there was any game where I could like Eternal Sunshine, forget having ever played it and play it again for the first time, it would be that game.
Oh, yeah.
I played it during COVID, and I played it in basically one sitting. Like over a 24-hour period, I played the game in its entirety. All of the different branching storylines and all that. And that game is just so good. I think in terms of, I'm not a big visual novels person. I've played a couple of them. I mean, really the two are that one and the sequel, Virtue's Last Reward. I don't know really what else to say about it other than that game has some just incredible like twists and turns that will just like leave you screaming at your television. I've watched people play it, like them playing it for the first time, and it is almost as satisfying, like them getting to those big moments. But it is one where I think when we talk about, you talk about Final Fantasy, when I think about like the ways that a game can tell a story and the ways that games in their sort of unique form are able to uniquely tell stories, I would put that at the top, at the top of the list, because I think it does such a good job.
Yes, but like Final Fantasy VI, does it have a scene where you're running down train tracks and fighting a train, and at one point you can suplex that train?
It does not have that, but I will tell you it gets pretty wild.
No, that's neat because like I actually have no experience with that game. Like
I've never played it.
yeah, so that makes me to hear you talk about it makes me really interested because I've heard you talk about it before.
Yeah, it would be. It's one of those things that like it would be close between this or Virtue's Last Reward. Virtue's Last Reward, I think, overstays its welcome a little bit. It's a little too long, and it goes some like even more wild directions. But I think, like I said, I played 999 in one day, and I think it's a good length. I think it's maybe got like 5 or 6 different endings, so it's not super. I mean, it's not super long. Or whereas I think Virtue's Last Reward has like near 20 or something. But it just it does such a good job, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. It's also often on sale, so for people.
Yep.
I will have to make a note of that because I feel like that's a game I want to play at some point.
Same.
One last thing that I will say. There's this shirt that I saw that was so good. So have people heard of the 999 challenge for like baseball games? 9 beers, 9 hot dogs, 9 innings.
Yes, yes.
And I saw this shirt that was that with the 999 characters on it. And I was like, I've got to get this shirt
like
in some
the
way.
perfect mixture of you.
Yeah.
It was so good. And
It's the most Mario shirt I've ever heard
Yes,
of.
honestly.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyways, that's the last thing I'll say about it.
That's amazing.
All right, so for my third game, I'm going to call an audible here from what I originally wrote down because I feel like the game I'm going to talk about instead, like, prep me maybe for this more. So I'm going to talk about Rygar for the NES. So Rygar is one of those proto Metroidvanias. And if you've listened to this podcast, you know I love Metroidvania games. I think that the search action genre of games might be my favorite genre of games. So I love Super Metroid. I love Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Those are the two that everybody usually talks about. Rygar is this game that is it's based on an arcade game, but the arcade game is kind of a straightforward go left to right, kill the enemies, and advance. And Rygar, when they ported it to the NES, they were like, okay, well, we can't get the graphics and everything at that level, but what if we tried to expand this game in some way? So they make it this sort of open world adventure where you can go through different doors and go into different areas. And most of the game is played from a side-scrolling perspective, but sometimes you'll go into areas and it'll be overhead all of a sudden. And I'll say that game is like being held together by like rubber bands. Like it's a lot like the Strider for NES. Strider on the NES is a game that like is a proto Metroidvania. You could say DuckTales as well.
Oh, yeah.
DuckTales is probably the most polished of these three games. But like there's part of me that loves Strider and Rygar because like they feel like at any moment they could just go falling apart and the pieces flying everywhere because they're being incredibly ambitious with what they're trying to make. At a time when nobody really had a formula. Metroid was out, but like even the original Metroid, to go back and play that now, it is not what we think of post Super Metroid, what we think of Metroid games being. And I just absolutely love this game. there's so many things that, like, as you play this game for the first time, you start figuring out, and at the time were not at all common in games of that era. So, the fact that you level up the more that you attack enemies and everything, right? And that's not explained in the game. Like, you just kind of have to figure it out, and then you're given clues of, hey, go here, and there's something. But then you have to figure out, oh, I actually have to climb up this tower in order to get this item. It feels like that. And I think one of the things that's really interesting going back and playing some old Commodore and Atari and early NES games is they are very much the building blocks of genres we would come to love later. Yeah. But it's very much, you can tell people who don't really know what they're doing in creating that genre. And there's something, I don't want to make the comparison. They're not as well polished as something like as Frankenstein, but there's something really cool when you go back and you read Frankenstein, you're like, oh, she was writing the first science fiction novel. She didn't know she was writing the first science fiction novel. And when you play one of these games, you're like, well, they didn't know what they were making with Rygar, did they? Like, they're making a game that's part RPG, part like action game, part Metroidvania, when these terms didn't really exist in those contexts. And so it ends up being this like incredibly impactful game that becomes my favorite genre of games. And this is like, along with Blaster Master and Strider and DuckTales and a lot of games of this era, kind of one of the foundational building blocks that I feel like a lot of those games built off of as they went forward. And it's still one of those games I'll sit down and play Rygar to this day and like be very happy and enjoy it. So I feel like it holds up pretty well, though. When you go back and play it now, you very much do go, man, this game is like all sorts of janky. Like, and there's a certain charm to that as well for me.
Yeah, that was one that we played earlier this semester, and it was an experience playing it for the first time. It was good, but the different directions, and I remember when it swapped from that side view to that top view, I was like, oh, this game is doing things.
Yeah, and some of those don't work because they has those wires across the river, and you have to get the hook in order to like go across, and that doesn't always work 100%. And so sometimes you just die, and but it's ambitious, and I think that's something that a lot of modern games have lost. That we talked about Resident Evil. Resident Evil at that time was incredibly ambitious, and I feel like in some ways those games have lost that ambition. They're very well made today, but they've lost that ambition that the early Resident Evils had. And I think this is, for me, one of those that sort of paves that way.
Yeah.
All right. Alicia, your fourth game?
So my fourth game is the Mega Man series. This one, don't ask me how I found this music creator, but because I can't remember, but there's a musician called Hyadane, and somehow I got started listening to, he's a Japanese music artist. He actually now works in video game and anime music. So he did one of the One Piece themes. He did a song for the Rubicante fight in Final Fantasy 14 that was carried over from a parody song that he had made in 2004 or something. But he also has a series of songs for all of the Wily bots from Mega Man 2. And somehow I clicked on one and got hooked. And so from there, my sister and I got into Mega Man, and this was, early mid-thousands. So Twitch wasn't a thing, and Let's Playing on YouTube wasn't massive like it is today. But we were we like these songs. We want to know more. It's a video game. We don't know. We can't find this video game, like we can't buy it or whatever, so we're gonna look up somebody playing it. And I remember my mom being like, why would you watch someone play a game? Why don't you just play the game? And we're like, because we don't have the game, Mom.
Mom. With the credit card.
Yeah, it's only $20. But so looking up that was what got us started watching Let's Player called Roam Mithril. And this was God, I think he's on like year 15 on YouTube now, and this was like in his second or third year. So this was a minute ago, but like Roam Mithril has become a staple of my life. Like when I'm having bad anxiety, I go rewatch his Pikmin 1 run. When I'm sad, I'll like rewatch his Pokemon No Evolution runs, or or when I'm feeling nostalgic, I'll go back and rewatch. He does the Mega Man games. He always does perfect runs where he won't use any of the Wily Bot abilities. It's just the normal blaster and no hit, which, you know, again, at the time, not a lot of people were doing in the way that like a lot of people do that now. But so that was really the first, you know, and then like as a couple years passed, you know, my friends started watching like Jacksepticeye and Markiplier and all of them. But like Roam Mithril is still my OG YouTube content, like genuinely the reason that like when I don't know what to watch, I'll look up a Let's Play of whatever game I'm in the mood for. And so you know, we of course had our time where Mega Man was a hyperfixation and I wrote fan fiction and all of that good stuff, but even when it's not that, it still very much feels like coming home and like seeing old friends whenever anything Mega Man pops up.
And you all laughed at me for calling her the uwu gamer.
No,
I protested the anime gamer.
Okay.
I was only laughing because I thought it was very appropriate.
Yes, exactly.
I was just defending Justin's honor because he also deserves that credit.
I wish I could play more anime games. I wish I had the patience. Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Twitch being a
well, not even Twitch; it was YouTube,
right? Mm-hmm. But like somebody being nostalgic,
yeah,
like for that, right? Like that a generation has grown up with that being such an important part. Streaming, right? Whether it's YouTube, Twitch, whatever platform.
He couldn't stream it. It was HughesNet for 13 years. Sorry, it's a running. He has so many running gags. You know, we recently had an episode of the podcast titled "Always the Birds." That's a Roam Mithril gag. Like,
yeah,
that is my proudest moment that I've gotten.
So, you know, just the fact that like that's something that people like grow up who grew up with that now are able to look back and nostalgic on, right? Like, because I was very much like your mom. Why would anybody want to watch people play video games? Like, particularly people that they don't have any sort of relationship with, right? Like, it's one thing to watch your friends play a game, because like that's very similar to sitting on the couch and like passing the controller around.
Yep.
But like to watch complete strangers and to like build you know, like careful with the term relationship, but like a following,
be a fan.
Yeah, a fandom behind it, and then to like have nostalgia for that, right? In the way that we would have nostalgia for a television show that we grew up watching or something, is I think a big cultural shift, and that's interesting. All right, Christina, your next one.
Yeah, so my next one is Star Fox, both 64 and 0, because they're basically the same game.
Which are also the same game as the original Star Fox.
I mean, true, exactly. It's the same game over and over again. I never played I didn't play the original until after I played 0, but 64 was after we had gotten the N64 with the original Mario for that and Mario Kart, that was my first Christmas, like the Christmas after we got Star Fox, and the Rumble Pack came with it, and it was a lot. And I remember when I got it, I was like, "What is this game?" Like, Mom, what? And then I started to play it, and I was like, "Oh, okay." And I played it over and over and over again, and like I remember that being the game that I like tried the hardest with on certain things. Like there's one planet that you go to, Macbeth, that you can try to beat it the hard way, but good God, it takes forever. But then when you hit all the switches and make the train run into the thing, the first time I did that, it was like best day of my life at that point. And then for Zero, when I was writing my dissertation, I basically like didn't sleep because I wrote my dissertation in a month for various reasons. And so I would come home, I would watch either PewDiePie or Markiplier, and then I would play Star Fox Zero because there's a way that you could set it up on the Wii U where it was basically like playing the 64 version. And so it helped me, I don't know, get through probably one of the loneliest, like dissertation writing was one of the loneliest times of my life. And it was nice to have that to kind of help ground me when my brain was going in a million different directions, thinking about all of these things. And I'd be like, no, for this, 30 minutes to an hour that you're playing, you just focus on the game, like turn everything else off, just focus. And it was really helpful in like helping me wind down at night.
So how often do you go onto Google and type "do a barrel roll"?
I would message my cousin because my cousin got really obsessed with the game at the same time. And there's still times where I'll message him and go, "do a barrel roll."
Well, you know the trick if you type it into Google.
Does it do something? Oh, I'm going to do it now.
And that is just such a delightful like spark joy.
Oh,
if you type in "do a barrel roll" onto Google. It does a barrel roll.
But yeah,
if you ever need to smile and you only have 5 seconds,
just like
do a barrel roll.
Nice. But yeah, that game means quite a bit to me.
Yeah, I remember playing the original Star Fox and then playing Star Fox 64, and it felt like that was what that original game wanted to be.
Yes, absolutely.
Like it's basically a remake. Like all three of them are remakes of the same game. But it was like, okay, this is what we wanted to do. We didn't quite have the hardware yet, but like we had the vision. And I know people criticize 64 because it's an incredibly short game.
Yes.
Like once you figure out how to beat it, and it's not super difficult either. Like you can beat one of the paths pretty quickly.
Absolutely, yeah.
But like, man, that's like a really good game. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a reason people keep asking for more Star Fox because that feeling that original game gives you is just really great.
Absolutely.
All right, Mario, your fourth game.
My fourth game is Celeste.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually probably my favorite game of all time. This and the next one I'll talk about are pretty close. But Celeste is a game that on the first playthrough, just with its story and its narrative and its focus on mental health, I think is really impactful and powerful and meaningful to me and to a lot of people for similar reasons. But I think that's a game that has also become a pretty big point of connection for me and one friend in particular. This is the game that I don't remember. Just like one day we randomly decided, we'll do a race of it. I hadn't played that game in years. I don't know when the last time he had played it, but we decided to play it, and it kind of just became like a sort of regular thing that like every once in a while we would race it, and to the point where it became a game that both of us, but me in particularly, really kind of started speedrunning, and that was, I would say, the first game that I really got into speedrunning with. It's a game that I think my fastest time got like just under 45 minutes. And it's one that I played just so much of and put so much time into. And it's one that every once in a while we'll still, send a message to each other, or we'll be in a call and like, hey, you feel like climbing a mountain? And so, it's not one that we play a ton. There are other games that will race. Super Mario 64 has kind of not replaced it, but has become another one that the two of us will race and play through and speedrun pretty often. And so for a lot of different reasons, similar to God of War, it holds a lot of meaning for me beyond, again, just how beautiful I think that game is with the story it tells and how good it is, I think, with its gameplay. That is just another game that serves as like a point of connection to another person that I care about for me.
I think I'm taken aback just like that you can beat that game in 45 minutes.
Yeah, dude.
That's like a really difficult, if you've never played Celeste, that's a really difficult game to get through your first time. Yeah. I think for most people, at least.
So I presented on Celeste at NCA, and, in it, I say like, it's totally reasonable for somebody in their first time to die hundreds, if not over 1,000 times in that game. Like, sure. I think that's totally reasonable. And
sometimes on one screen.
And Dustin, who was also on the panel, I guess Sean was saying, made like a little face as like a, not, and he didn't know if it was like I don't think that's real, or just like at a shock type of thing. But it's one of those things that's like, no, that is a real game that you can just death cycle over and over and over again.
But you also brought up the pause menu screen. Is it the pause menu screen?
It's a loading screen.
It's a loading screen.
Yeah, that game is also very supportive and forgiving, even though it is so difficult. And there's a loading screen between one of the levels that just says, be proud of your death count. The more times you die, the more you die, the more you're learning. Mm-hmm. As compared to other games that I think are also like kind of highly precise in terms of their platforming, like a Super Meat Boy, or even more so like an I Want to Be the Guy, that can be almost mocking in its difficulty. So there's a lot about that game. I was going back and forth. Like I said, I do think I'd probably say it's my favorite game of all time. But the next one that I'll talk about is, in many ways, serves the same sort of role. And
like, I don't think this is a spoiler to say, like, that is a game about mental health. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think as an incredibly challenging game about mental health, to like be supportive of the player in it, right? To like, and there are settings in that game so that you can make that game easier. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's a more positive way to like build a super challenging game like that, right? It's a more inclusive way of building a game of that sort today.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very good game. People who haven't played Celeste should definitely play Celeste.
I think that's where I feel is like, in recognizing how difficult it is, I hesitate to recommend it to people because it's frustrating, but I do think it's one that if you don't know if you would be able to play it, I at the very least recommend you go watch a playthrough, or watch just like the cutscenes to be able to like see the story of this game.
Well, it's a game that's not unfair.
Yes.
And I think that's the key, right? Mm-hmm. It's super challenging, but it's always fair.
Yeah.
All right. So my next game is one I really struggled with which one to pick. I wanted to pick a game from the Commodore 64 era, specifically because of my siblings. And so I thought about Beachhead 1 and 2 because we played an awful lot of that, and we still to this day will sometimes say to each other, "Ha, "You can't hurt me," which is like this digitized sample in the game. And there's also like something like Spy versus Spy, which is based on the Mad magazine comic strip. We played a lot of that, or even something like a Impossible Mission. The opening line in that game when you first like load into the game, it says, "Stay for a while, stay forever, ha ha ha." And so like that's ingrained into our heads, and we'll say that to each other. But I think the game that we probably spent the most time actually playing were summer games and winter games. And I'm kind of including them all together. So these were mini game collections. Probably people today know them better for like California Games, which was sort of the last one in this franchise that they did. So they did like Summer Games 1 and 2 and Winter Games and World Games. And we had all of those on the Commodore 64. And we just played those games a lot, and it was always this like challenge of one-upping and beating each other's scores or each other's times. And a lot of the games in here are button mashers in the sort of old track and field style. So it's just you like banging on a button as quickly as you can, or it's you rotating the joystick around in the cycling game, or the gymnastics games, or the long jump game in winter games are, hey, do this, and then you have to press in a certain order, like a combo, in order to do certain tricks and moves. But like those just became games where you could sit around, particularly with my brother and sister, but also like friends, my cousins. We would sit around and just play those games. And because they're very quick, short mini games, even if only one player is playing at a time, you can just swap the controller to the next person. Mm-hmm. So like this person has their chance and then this person. And so these were sort of party games before that term had been coined, I guess. And there's so many games from that era that we spent a lot of time playing together. There's the Halley Project, which is like Halley's Comet, and you're flying in outer space. And I remember us kind of sitting around and like acting out what was playing in the game and everything. So, when you take off in the space shuttle, like we would sort of act that out and everything. But like, I feel like the summer and winter games are the ones that we probably put the most time into. And, when I think about like just sort of mini games that are easy to go back to over and over again, I think there's something still very charming about those games that hasn't entirely been replicated in a lot of more modern games. All right, Alicia, it is time for your fifth and final pick.
Yeah, so I will say, when I was coming up with this list, I did try to. One of the things that I thought about was similar to what Christina said earlier, of like, what games have I talked about a lot lately? Like, what ones do I not talk about as much? But I think it would be it would be a mistake for me to do this list and not talk about Pokemon. I've told this story before. I'll probably tell it again. Pokemon Blue was my first video game ever. I was 5 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought it was like the show where the Pokemon fainted and then you caught them. So I got through the first 4 gyms with just my Bulbasaur/Ivysaur/Venusaur, because I just would knock Pokemon out and assumed that meant I caught them. And it wasn't until I needed my sister's help when she looked and was like, "Where are all your Pokemon?" And I was like, "Well, they're in the PC, aren't they?" "No. Have you not caught any Pokemon?" I'm like, well, it's like the show. And so she made me walk all the way back to Pallet Town and just go into that first patch of grass and just chuck Pokeballs at a Pidgey until I caught it. And she made me replay all the way through, like catching more Pokemon. And that, talk about a game held together with duct tape and dreams. those Gen 1 games are janky as all get out, but have such a special place in my heart. And every time that a new one comes out, it makes me happy. Even if it's not a fabulous game, just and the ways that it's spread into other areas of, the cartoon was super important to me growing up. The original cartoon is still very nostalgic and special to me. Even when Pokemon Go came out, that became a big thing with my family. When now that TCG Pocket is out, that's becoming a big thing. And so Pokemon, I think, is just one of those pillars of my life that will always be there. And so like being able to go back and revisit the old games and still see new things coming out, I think that Pokemon will always be one of the most important series in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm still amazed, given that first game, what that franchise has become, and that it's persisted, right? That it's lasted as long as it has. Not because that first game's bad, but just because, that first game's good, but
it's janky.
I could not have predicted, right?
Well, you think about, they thought Gen 2 would be the end. That's why with the Johto games, they had you go back to Kanto and you get to the top of Mount Silver and beat the original champion, because that was all they'd planned. And then it was like, oh, okay, we're gonna keep going.
Yeah.
But even I've been, one of my other comfort Let's Players is Luca Jin, and she's a adult woman, late 30s, early 40s at this point, never played Pokemon, and so she has her blind playthroughs of Pokemon White and Pokemon Heart Gold and Pokemon Platinum, and getting to experience people experiencing it for the first time. Or my cousin's kids, where you don't know what to get them for Christmas, but we'll get them a Pokemon Lego set or Pokemon cards or whatever, and just getting to share it with so many people is incredibly special.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Christina, your fifth and final pick.
Yeah, so I knew that I wanted to do one, again, that my sister and I used to play, just because that was really formative years with video games. And I was thinking about Smash Bros. I thought about Mario Party, and I came back to Mario Kart just because that's what I still play quite a bit of. I used to have a joke that's there are two things that absolutely no one can get me on. One of them was Mario Kart. And so...
Wait, what's the other?
Excuse me, we're not that close.
That's fair.
It's something to do with theater, I think. I don't even remember. That's why. Anyway, so I've been to a tournament in Mario Kart where someone did get me. I definitely was humbled that night. But yeah, it was the way my sister and I used to decide, okay, who does this load of laundry or who goes and gets it from the whatever. And I remember on, days that, I'm sad or whatever, I could put on Mario Kart and just drive. And again, it was another one of those things that maybe dissociation, sure, whatever, but also a fun, I don't know, a way to just kind of focus. And again, it's one of those games that anybody can play. It does take a while to master, get good at, whatever. But that if you're trying to, have a party game, it's definitely one of those.
I would just like to point out, I'm pretty sure I beat you at Garfield Furriest Karting.
Garfield is not Mario Kart.
Oh, they both have kart in names.
Listen,
they can't be that different.
Listen to me, Mario.
You're just driving a cart around.
They are, though. They are. They're so different.
I mean, right, Garfield's better.
Sounds like coping.
My God. Listen, I get it. I roast you 30, 40 episodes. You get me on the 100th. It's fine. I'll take it.
And she sits over there and stews away. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's probably the ultimate party game, right?
Agreed.
It's simple, pick up to play. Everyone loves it.
Yeah.
Great game. Mm-hmm. All right, Mario, your fifth and final pick.
My final pick is Ocarina of Time, and to a lesser extent, some of them a far, far lesser extent, the rest of the N64 library. But Ocarina of Time, I think so talking about Celeste last, there's a period of time where it was like Celeste was easily number one. Nothing would even get close to it. But as I've played a lot of Ocarina of Time this year, there's a friend who the same friend who I had actually raced Celeste with, we would join a community event, and in that event, there was always an Ocarina of Time randomizer race where it would be a co-op. So 2 people would race through it, and it was a bunch of teams of 2. And he and I would typically be on a team. And I think at the beginning of the year, he had said, I've got these gaming-related goals I'd like to achieve for 2024. Most of them were speedrunning related. And I had sort of jokingly said, what about, we could do a monthly Zooter together. And I didn't say together. I think I should just do a monthly one. And he was like, no, you know the deal. I do one a year, and you tell me exactly what to do so that we can finish. And, I was like, I'll even do the first one with you. And it's turned into us doing more than one a month. But we've played a lot of them this year. And just a couple of weeks ago, he tried to do his first one solo. And so watching that and and he's beaten a couple of them solo at this point, but getting to watch him play it and getting to, again, experience that with this friend, playing through it, the randomizer aspect of it, making it essentially a fresh playthrough every time, is just, again, it's a really great experience, and one that has really bolstered this friendship that means a lot to me.
Yeah, and Ocarina of Time is such an amazing game.
Agreed.
Yeah, aside from the fact that it's just one of the greatest games of all time.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have a friend that that's one of, I don't know if it's a key pillar, but it's a pillar of our friendship, because we both love that game, and we'll kind of talk about it as a sort of touchstone, and I feel like that's, again, one of those games, like a few of these others we've talked about, that really reaches out to new audiences. It's not an easy game, really. The first time you're playing it, it's challenging, but it feels like a game that's very sort of welcoming into it and everything. So I feel like it's a game that people who don't play video games, or maybe think they don't like video games, can try. And then if they want that extra challenge, they can do the randomizer you're doing, which I would not attempt.
Yeah. I wouldn't either. My first playthrough, well, it technically wasn't even my playthrough. The little boy that I babysat loved that game, and he had the guide book, which I don't know how we would have done the water temple without the guidebook, honestly. So I would sit there and I would read the guidebook to him, and he would do it. But that was, that's the kind of babysitter I am. But yeah, it's a great game.
All right. My fifth and final game is Super Mario Brothers 2.
Yeah.
And this is the American version, Super Mario Bros. 2, not the Lost Levels. When I was around this age that this game came out, so I would have been 8 or 9 when this game came out. I had a cousin, Trad, who would come over a lot of times on weekend nights, like on a Friday or Saturday night, partly because we were the same age, and so he would come over and we would play video games or watch movies, and, that sort of thing. But also his dad had gone through a divorce, and it was my mom's brother, and so he would come over and hang out with my parents, and they would watch I'm going to say an adult movie, not that kind of adult movie. They would watch a movie that had no interest for children, because it was, it was about paying taxes and doing adult stuff. And so we would, they would rent a movie, they would rent us a video game often, and we would go upstairs in my room, play video games, and my sister would hang out with us and do stuff too, and we also played with our toys and all that. And so I remember he got Super Mario Brothers 2, and if you don't know at the time, there was actually a shortage on Super Mario Brothers 2 when it came out. There was a chip shortage, and it affected all NES games, but it mostly, more dramatically affected Super Mario Brothers 2 because it was a huge release and everybody was excited to get it, so it sold out everywhere. He managed to get a copy. He got it for Christmas.
Oh, wow.
So he brought it over, and we just played that game, swapping back and forth for a long time, playing that game. And so I actually beat the game before he did. He left it with me one week and was like, hey, I'm doing something. I forgot. He was going to his mom's house or something. And he's like, so I can't play this. Do you just want to keep it this week? And I kept it and played through it and actually beat the game. That's a really short game now, but like it took us like a couple of weeks to get through it. And so, you know, part of this is like, those are very good memories and everything. But like, I think about that game because, so one of the things that's really interesting about that game is that's a game designed to reward failing. So there's like World 3, I think it is, the first, at the beginning of the level, when you go into it, there's a giant waterfall and you have to climb up the waterfall. Except if you fall, there's actually a warp at the bottom of the waterfall, but you have to fall and land on this little tiny island at the bottom of the waterfall. And so I remember we were playing and we had to like turn it off, like go to dinner or leave or something. And my sister was sitting there and we're like, hey, do you want to play this? And she was like, oh, I'll just kill you. And so she jumped off the waterfall and fell and like discovered this. And as you can imagine, we were like, no, you get out of the way. Like, we have no idea this is down here. And my sister is older, so like she probably could have beat us at that point if she wanted to. But like, you know, it rewards that in like this sort of like failing discovers new things and is a really interesting design decision in that game. And so like there's other areas where you have to get sucked under quicksand to like discover secret areas and everything. And that game plays with that a lot. It was also just this radical different take on Mario Brothers, right? Like, and at that time, none of us knew of the lost levels. So like none of that mattered. There was no argument about, it's not really Super Mario Brothers 2. Like nobody had those sorts of debates. And so as we got older, I saw my cousin less and less. He got involved in some things that were not healthy for him. And then he actually died a little over a decade ago. And the other day was actually, would have been his 45th birthday. And so whenever I see Super Mario Brothers 2, I think of him. To this day, that game reminds me of him. And a more like kind of bigger view thing is I think about how that game is about how failure isn't the end. And I think like there are other games that do that, like the Wario games do that really well of failing is not failure in the games. And I think we've talked about it with some of the other games today. Like some of these games are, will hold your hand or will do things for you as the player. But I always think about that with that game. And I think about like his life. And I think at times he probably felt like he had failed. And I think about that game as a sort of metaphor on life, and that like failing in life is not the end, right? Like failing in that game is not the end. And in fact, sometimes failing is how you get ahead. And so I think that game is first like vastly underrated. Everybody talks about Mario 3 and Mario World, which are fantastic games. I think Mario 2 is like maybe my favorite Mario of the Marios on the NES. But then I think about like all the like sort of emotional attachment to it. And I think about what I think that game says in a very important way. You know, like Galaga does the same thing with like, hey, your ship gets captured, but actually it's a reward if you like rescue your ship. And I don't think enough games do that. And I think it's a really interesting design for making a video game. And it holds a special place for me because maybe more than any other game, it holds in a direct emotional attachment. All right, that does it for our 5 games each. So our big question this week is, what is your favorite moment from the Saluki Gamescast?
I think for this one we should go from most recent joiner to the OGs.
I'm cool with that. I had a rough time thinking of this because, like, I honestly just enjoy coming in and talking about games. I don't have a lot of people in my life that I can that I can do this with now. Because even, like, I mentioned my sister a lot, and we played, and she's a mom now and has a life and is an alcoholic. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, she kind of is, but like, and so she definitely does. She's, she's not a nerd anymore, and so it's really
nothing makes you cooler than having a kid.
I just meant, like, she's too busy to be a nerd now. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
it's
I
one of those
understand.
things.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I have none of those real life things to do, and so I definitely this is still important to me because I use it for therapy and things like that, and so. I don't know. It's just really nice. Like, I wrote down roasting Mario. I wrote down the Mortal Kombat conversation we had with OJ. I wrote down coming up with fun titles, because but all of it is I just enjoy it, and so yeah, that's probably a cop out, but that's what I got.
I think that completely works.
Okay.
And I'll say we are very happy to be that for you.
Yeah.
I think that's true of all of us, right? Like, this is a chance to geek out about something very specific that I have friends that I can do this with, but like not on a weekly schedule.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mario, how about you?
So I don't even remember what the context of this story was, but Alicia mentioned
I knew this was coming.
rabbits with the smoke, and there was a point where Justin and I looked at each other and, saying nothing, it was communicated, what the hell is she talking about?
That was non-verbally. That was the best moment.
And it just, I mean, and I think we did address it, and it just devolved the conversation, and that was a great moment.
Yeah, I just remember like listening to her, and it got more and more bizarre, and I looked over at Christina, and Christina was just sort of nodding along, and I was like, did I miss something?
No.
Like, is there like a detail I've missed? And so finally I just looked over at you, and you had the same like just exasperated, puzzled look, and I was like, oh, well, thank goodness.
I will say, y'all looked how I felt on the inside. I'm just a very supportive audience member. I'm gonna let you go on your Delulu. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense in your head.
Well, normally, right? Like, we would never call somebody out for something like that. Like, it was just so bizarre. And Alicia told the story as if we all should understand and, like, knew this and, like, understood her references.
I don't understand how you don't know that when campfire smoke is coming in your face, you say, I hate white rabbits, and it goes away.
Still don't get it.
But yes, it is probably the most derailed this podcast has ever gotten in an episode, because I feel like we went off track for like 30, 40 minutes and the episode never quite recovered. All right, Alicia.
So this is actually a beautiful time because I couldn't pick just one. I just was like all of the running gags, from me updating controllers to OJ beating up Ryan in the parking lot to chaos to Christina ragging on Mario to Justin making fun of me for Sonic. Like, just I
That doesn't
love.
sound like something I do.
Excuse me, during Alicia's show, didn't you ask a question about Sonic? on.
Yeah.
I was trying to be supportive.
A supportive
But it's
audience
like,
member.
I love that we've been
You weren't
able,
asking a question.
and this is part of like what I want to say for episode 100 too, is like I love that we've been able to have this go for so long, that we have these gags that we've had from 2.5, 3 years ago that still mean something and that we still will bring up, and just getting to share this and have all of this is so wonderful.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's kind of neat about that too is that the podcast hasn't devolved entirely into that, so it's still accessible to somebody new coming in, and like we do a lot to explain those in jokes so that people feel included with that, and I think that's been very good. And I've had people from outside say that's one of the things they like is that it doesn't feel like a long running podcast that like they join in and they go, I have no idea what these people are talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes, but like not the entire length of the podcast.
For sure.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of mine have been mentioned, and a lot of it has been those kind of like long running jokes. Certainly, like OJ's chaos. I feel like
I think you mean chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like OJ, some of the stories that they shared on here where like OJ starts a story and it sounds very heartwarming, and then it just goes in
the Chucky doll.
Yeah, it goes in the most like disturbing ways that you can imagine. And OJ tells it very matter of fact.
Yeah.
And you're trying not to laugh because you want to be supportive, but like at some point you're just like, I'm sorry, OJ, I'm having to laugh at your suffering. And luckily, I think they understand that.
Oh, for sure.
We're not laughing at OJ. We're laughing with OJ.
Yeah.
So, but, for my favorite thing of this podcast, and I feel like this happened very organically, like the people that have been part of this podcast have been, well, I'll say right from the beginning, right? Like we had a queer person as part of this podcast right from the beginning.
We had two.
Right? Yeah.
Ryan and OJ both.
We had a woman as part of this podcast, and you listen to a lot of video game podcasts, right? And women are excluded. We've had multiple women as guests on this podcast, right? We've had
we now have two.
Yeah. We've had we've had trans people as part of this podcast. We've had non-binary people as part of this podcast, and none of that was by design. And maybe that's a failing on my part. Maybe I should have went in with more intent and everything. But like the idea was always to have a podcast that was very open and would bring in different people and like give different people a chance to voice opinions from different perspectives. And that's evolved very sort of organically, and that people have embraced that, and that listeners have embraced that and been like very supportive of that. I think has been one of the more rewarding aspects of this for me, because I think it does bring in like very different viewpoints, at least of the like video game podcasts I listen to. And so, I hear different opinions than what I hear a lot of times, even podcasts I hear that are more like sort of open and bringing in different types of people. So I think that's been like one of my favorite experiences in doing this. Besides all the like sort of goofy moments and everything that we've had as part of it. All right, that does it for this episode. This has been 100 episodes. I have to admit, when I started this, I did not necessarily assume we'd be doing it 3 years later. I didn't necessarily assume that the cast would like be replaced, and then those new replaced people would outlast the original members, which at this point, Mario, I think you're like maybe an episode away from having been here longer than Ryan was originally, which is like cool, like because I still sort of think of Ryan as being here for forever as part of this and everything, and now it's gone on so long that somebody might have actually outlasted Ryan's original run on here, and soon it'll be outlasting OJ, and
no one's gonna outlast me.
Mario's look.
That is a challenge.
I feel like that
Depends on how fast you get a job. Because I'm sure you'd rather take that than be in here for another year.
That's true.
But like that's been a really cool experience doing this, and I like listening to all of you sort of recount your experiences. Obviously, talking to Ryan and OJ, that's been a really kind of fun journey to go through and see everybody's like different experiences they've taken, the different the different joy that everybody sort of takes out of it. And then also talking to people who listen to the podcast, and some of our guests sometimes that have been on here and their reactions that they've told me afterwards about how they felt being part of it. It's always felt like a very positive environment. And I think that is a testament to all of you for making it that. And so I'm thankful for that. And, like I said, I never thought this would make it to 100 episodes, 3 years into it. And if that means that there's a chance we'll get to 200, that's an exciting experience. And I don't know what 200 looks like. I hope Alicia is gone by episode 200.
I better be.
And I say that in the most positive way possible.
No, don't go away, Matt. Just go away. I better not be here for episode 200 unless I'm a returning special guest. But genuinely, I do think this podcast has been, doing a PhD is hard. And like coming in and having this as a staple for the last 3 years has been so incredible. It's part of my self-care every week to like get to come and do this. And so I'm really proud that we've made it to episode 100, and I look forward to the podcast making it to episode 200.
With or without you.
With or without me. But I'm not leaving. I'm still here. But I'll leave eventually, but not right now. Like, this is not a goodbye episode for me. This is just me being emotional and being happy and proud that we've made it to 100 episodes.
I don't know. Mario seems to be ushering you out the door.
It would genuinely be for Alicia's own good.
No, this is all for you. Good for you. Get out. Send us a letter.
Write in to justin.young@siu.edu.
That's how you'll keep in touch going forward. I think the other thing just to note here is we mentioned this sometimes on the podcast, but we have a Facebook Messenger group that not only the four of us are in, but also Ryan and OJ are in. And that's been a really like fun experience. And, things like we've often made it into content for this podcast, but going to see Borderlands or going to IHOP, I think it's hopefully comes across to those listening, but I think it's become very clear to all of us that the relationships that have been built through this have become very strong. People have become friends. It is not just something that we do for academic purposes, even if that's often the way that we frame it and talk about it. And so for me personally, that's been a very rewarding part of this experience. But that does it for our 100th anniversary spectacular. Thank you.
100th anniversary.
Well, it's the 100th episode.
That's the anniversary of the...
It works. Our 100th episode spectacular.
It works. I was just expecting you to make the Blues Clues noise again.
But, thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who has participated. I feel like if I try to list off everybody who's been a guest, their names, I'm going to leave somebody out. But thank you to everybody who's ever been a guest on this podcast. Thank you to everybody who has or is currently listening to this podcast. This has been a fantastic experience, and doing this episode and hearing everybody's stories and sharing that, hopefully that's been entertaining for you. And we will be back soon with another episode. Until then, check out SalukiGames.com, and we look forward to another 100.